Well, for more on the issue of digital sovereignty, we can speak to Layla Merck, an entrepreneur at tech investment boutique Maresquier Partners. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
I want to start off with a hypothetical question that's maybe a bit extreme, but if the US suddenly cut off Europe's access to all US-based or US-owned digital resources, what would that look like? What would Europe have left?
Well, that's what we would call a kill switch. That the risk of potentially Trump trying to push and do this kind of strong move that he does to make the EU banned. Honestly, that would be absolutely brutal. We would have under 24 hours almost all administrations, all companies, all you were mentioning Visa and Mastercard, all the way of payment that could drop down. That would be completely disastrous. I think there are a few think tanks actually working on those critical scenarios. They are very unlikely, but improbable doesn't mean impossible. And when you're a sovereign nation, unlikely is a very dangerous gamble.
So you mentioned that Europe is, just in case preparing for that kind of scenario, even though it is unlikely. How can Europe prepare? I mean, what needs to be done to avoid having that be a disaster?
Yes. So is Europe really preparing? It is. It is preparing well. It's different. But the idea for Europe is we can see that they are trying to put, the Digital Euro Act, for example, to try to work on more sovereign ways of doing transaction. They're also working on the Digital Network Act. That is an act trying to see how is the internet dependency coming from, like the cables under the sea, the data centers, all the internet global transaction, how they can make that more sovereign with better actors like OVH or more, sovereign actors. So they're working on that things. I would say that the main thing the EU is kind of like taking into account right now, it's always the same cycle that we see every time. It's we go through rapid innovation, we adopt high performance and quite often US tools. Then we kind of like pass through a comfort phase where efficiency is prioritized, and then you kind of like don't see the dependency starting. And then you enter a crisis phase. We see that with Snowden, we see that with the Cloud Act, we see that with Ukraine, with the COVID, and now we see that with Greenland. And now we feel like the dependency is intolerable. Will this time crisis be enough to actually make the EU structure a kind of hybrid response to be able not to rely only on the US infrastructure? That's where it's a big question.
So the U.S., you're saying, is in crisis mode right now about this. Can you give a sense of a timeline? I mean, how long would it take at this point, the EU, to become more independent?
The question is, are we talking about autarky or are we talking about de-risking? If we're talking about autarky, it's an expensive illusion and almost impossible. Let's be clear on that. We cannot be 100% fully sovereign. That would require estimation where around 3.6 trillion over 10 years. We cannot do that. But if we work on the de-risking strategy, what is a de-risking strategy? It's not replacing, but reducing key points of vulnerability, having built, for example, building alternatives. We would talk about a 300 billion, so 10 times cheaper, to secure kind of 20% of the market shares on critical techs. So only to achieve 20% of the market shares, we need to invest 300 billion over 10 years. I think that if we talk about a crisis mode, the most important and roadmap to resilience would be on the short term. So from now in the next 6 months, to just do something that might seem very, very lame, but just map the paralysis. Just trying to know exactly what would happen if that and that and that were to stop working. So we need to map the dependencies. Then on a more medium term, we need to work on the hybridization. So, multi-cloud adoption, having the capacity to deploy sovereign tools on the most important infrastructure, like the government, like the main administrations, work on what they call the anti-coercion instrument. So that's basically a tool, and that's actually quite a powerful one for the EU to work together to put so much trade and pressure in the United States that would act as a dissuasive weapon against technological blackmail. But then if we talk on the long run, so from 2 years from now, we need to work on the physical infrastructure side because it requires time. Undersea cable, data center, European Chips Act, all of those things.
When we talk about de-risking, can you talk about kind of what areas are the priorities and what alternatives are there in the works? For example, is Europe working on an alternative payment system?
Well, you mentioned the payment. Payment is for sure should be one of the top priority. Why should it be? Because actually we rely 95% of every payments rely on two American companies, Visa and MasterCard. So even though we are working on alternative cards, the infrastructure it runs through actually goes through the United States. So right now, even though if it's a critical infrastructure, the capacity to pay in a country is just so basic, almost all of that depends and relies on the United States. So that's where the European payment initiatives and the digital euro need to be pushed forward much faster, because this is critical. You were asking about other critical area. You can think of, well, all the listed companies. More than 70% of listed companies use American tools to do, well, basically almost everything. The government, the administration of a country, that would be the first step to assure that we can react fast enough.
And we're talking about Europe, but I imagine most countries in the world are in a similar or even worse position. Are there any countries in the world that have digital sovereignty other than maybe the US and China?
Oh, that's a good question. To some extent, Russia is pretty well positioned. They are really, really focused on trying to be as autonomous as they can. It's also, understandable seeing the kind of attitude they have toward other countries as well. But no, what you're highlighting is completely true. Europe might be in a tricky position, but the rest of the world is as well. The kind of thing that makes Europe even more vulnerable is the fact that Europe is such a symbiotic market with the United States. Europe is huge, but I would say that the balance between Europe and US, when you look at the amounts of business that is made, is quite balanced. The symbiotic relationship between the two would mean that if there were to be a frontal clash between the two, that would be completely disastrous for both, but Europe would not have any ways of recovering. When other countries kind of like build other alliances, in their own region. You can think about India, you can think about some African countries. I would say that the need of Europe to work through the US infrastructure is to a certain extent even worse.
And I imagine many of our viewers and myself use major US-based services like Google. Is it important for individuals to be looking for alternatives that are based in our own countries of residence?
It's a good question. I think, of course, it's important. The first thing is to realize, just acknowledge the fact that, well, on your phones, you use only Apple, Android, or iOS, just to realize that. You realize that on social medias, for example, well, you realize only on US-based company, or maybe TikTok for new generations. So just realizing that first is something good. But again, it's not because you shift a tool, it's not because you shift and you go to, like, I don't know, a French-made app, that actually the French-made app is not running through a US infrastructure. So yes, it's important for citizens to care about that, but I would say what is even more important than trying to find an alternative is actually pressure your governments and pressure people who vote for to actually work on the infrastructure level, because this is something they can do, this is something citizens cannot do. So rather than taking action and trying to do what you can, is more really acknowledging it and vote for people who are going to implement new policies.
Yeah, big structural changes need to take place. Layla Merk, thank you again so much for sharing your expertise with us this morning. That's Layla Merk, an entrepreneur at tech investment boutique Moresky Partners, speaking to us about digital sovereignty.